Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our International Center on Nonviolent Conflict academic webinar series. My name is Steve Chase, and I'm the manager of academic initiatives at ICNC, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. Today we have with us Dr. Olena Nikolayenko, talking about how youth movements in Eastern Europe have combined civil resistance tactics with election campaigns in an attempt to win rights, freedom, and justice. She'll be drawing on her research from her new book, Youth Movements and Elections in Eastern Europe, to clarify our understanding of both successes and failures in order to develop strategic takeaways for civil resistors in Eastern Europe, but all around the world. During the presentation, which is going to last, the webinar will last about an hour. Olena will be talking for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A. And so the way you can ask questions, there's two different ways, which is, if you'll notice on the screen, there's the first blue arrow to the left, shows about a way where you can raise your hand and I'll be able to see you, and then I'll mention your first name and unmute you. And then you can ask your question on air. The other way is, if you don't want to speak on air, you can type out questions into the question box, which is the lower arrow to the right, showing you how to get to that. And then I will be looking at that and then posing questions to our panelist, our presenter, and she'll answer them. So those are the two ways. I encourage you to jot down your questions as we go. So when we get to the question and answer portion, a little more than halfway through our hour together, you'll be able to have it in mind and be able to ask it. Now I'm going to be passing over the presentation controls so we can see the slideshow on Olena's screen. But while we do this, I'll also share a bit more background on her by way of introduction. Olena Nikolayenko is an associate professor of political science at Fordham University. She's also an associate at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. She received her PhD in political science from the University of Toronto and held visiting appointments at the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford University. She also was part of the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies and the Department of Sociology, the National University of Kiev at the Mohyla. I probably mispronounced that badly, but Olena can correct it, Academy in the Ukraine. Her research interests include comparative democratization, social movements, political behavior, women's activism, and youth activism, with a regional focus on Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia. In her recent book, which I mentioned before, Youth Movements and Elections in Eastern Europe, which was just published late last year by Cambridge University Press, she examines the tactical interactions between nonviolent youth movements and then the incumbent governments in 5 post-communist states: Azerbaijan, Belarus, Georgia, Serbia, and Ukraine. And with that, take it away, Olena, and thank you so much for presenting your webinar today.
Greetings to everybody. Thank you, Steve, for a very kind introduction. I also would like to take a moment to thank the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict for supporting my research, and in particular, supporting the manuscript development workshop that has significantly contributed to the quality of the final product. Over time, in various contexts, young people acted as agents of change by waging civil resistance. So in my book, I decided to focus on one of such instances when young people in Eastern Europe rose up. Before I turn our attention to discussion of the material, I just want to point out how relevant the topic of civil resistance, especially in non-democracies, is nowadays. If you look at the map of the made by the Freedom House, it shows that nearly half of the world's population today lives in non-democracies. You can see on this map all the countries colored in yellow or purple are defined by Freedom House as not free or partly free, where civil liberties and political rights are systematically violated. But nonetheless, elections have become a near universal feature of domestic politics. And even in countries where political rights are violated, incumbents seek to secure some modicum of legitimacy and maintain a facade of democracy by regularly holding elections. Oftentimes, autocrats look upon elections as a mechanism for extending the political longevity and securing the durability of the country regime. In contrast, the civil resistance often look upon elections as an opportunity for ushering in political change. And that's how young people whom I researched in my book project looked upon the national elections in their home countries in the early 2000s. Eastern Europe has seen an unprecedented rise of nonviolent youth movements in the turn of the 21st century. In 1998, a group of students at the University of Belgrade set up the youth movement named Otpor, which means resistance in Serbian. And initially, they focused on university issues, academic freedom, and press freedom, but then they turned their attention to the issue of free and fair elections and played a vital role in bringing down Slobodan Milosevic in 2000. And inspired by the success of Otpor, just 3 months after Milosevic's downfall, in 2001, on the eve of the presidential election, Belarusian activists set up the youth movement Zubru. And then this wave of youth mobilization continued with the emergence of the youth movement Kamara, which means enough in Georgian, on the eve of the 2003 parliamentary election. In Ukraine, not one, but 2 youth movements with the same name, Pora, which means it's time, were formed in 2004. And journalists, in order to distinguish between the 2 groups, named them Yellow Pora and Black Pora based upon the color of the insignia. And finally, in 2005, Azerbaijani youth was inspired by the previous examples of youth mobilization, and several youth groups emerged, including Maqam, Yenifikir, and Yoh. So it was a very remarkable tide of youth mobilization within a short period of time within the post-communist region. And what is also striking about these youth movements is that they had a lot of similarities. Nearly all of them were formed during the election year, and understandably they focused on the issue of free and fair elections. They also tackled the corruption in the public sector, in particular in the education sector, and press freedom. Furthermore, they selected similar methods of civil resistance, and came up with original ideas, staging street performances, distributing stickers, organizing rock concerts, and really displaying a great deal of creativity in the challenge of the regime. So you can see on your screens some outcomes of the creative resistance and also some illustrations of how ideas traveled from one moment to another at a time. The first image of the clenched fist is a symbol that Otpor, the Serbian youth, adopted to symbolize their struggle for social change. And Kumara activists 2 years in 2003 also liked this idea, so they just tinkered a little bit with the design of the movement's logo, but basically adopted the same idea to symbolize their struggle. And at the bottom, you can see two examples of posters that were designed by different youth movements in Eastern Europe. The first one, titled Время убирать, it's time to clean up, was produced by the Belarusian youth movement Zubr. And the second one, Пора наступати, it's time to advance, was produced by the Ukrainian youth movement Pora. And when I spoke with one of the designers representing the youth movement Pora, he mentioned to me how they really liked the idea that the Belarusian youth movement had to then, but then they decided to slightly change the image, and as you can see, they replaced the office shoe with a military boot to send a stronger message, and they also substituted insect in the picture. At that time, the incumbent Leonid Kuchma in Ukraine was known informally as the brown spider, so that's whom the movement was trying to remove from power, and that's how symbolically they tried to show it in the imagery. At that time, social media was not widely used in the region, and that's why stickers were one of the main means of communication with the wider public. So, despite all the similarities across the movements and the adoption of similar tactics, they differed in terms of their success. Some youth movements were more successful than others in mobilizing citizens and particularly young people against the regime. So in my project, I use 3 indicators of success. The first indicator is the size of the youth movement. The second one is youth vote for their position. And the third one is youth participation in post-election protests. I focus on the very last period of youth mobilization against the regime, the days, the election day and a short post-election period, because it was crucial to the mission of the youth movement to oust the incumbent from power and bring about political change. But at the same time, I also recognize that youth movements alone could not change the regime. So the outcome of electoral revolutions depends upon a wide range of factors. So turning our attention to the size of the youth movement. So even despite the fact that it's a very difficult task to really assess how many young people joined each of these youth movements. You can discern some differences across countries, across youth movements. I think without doubt that the Serbian youth movement was most successful in recruiting a large number of young people and building a network of activists across the country. Likewise, in Ukraine, there was a significantly large number of young people who participated in movement activities. But the youth movements in Azerbaijan were the weakest of all. And even despite the fact that initially Kenny Fekir claimed as many as 2,000 members, by the time of the election, it was decimated by the coercive apparatus. And each of the youth movements by November 2005 had approximately 100 members each. One of the tasks that this youth movement sat in front of them was not just to increase youth engagement in street actions, but also bring them to the polling stations so that they could cast a ballot in favor of their position and increase the chances of political change through peaceful means. So again, we can see, based upon public opinion data, that in Serbia, 8 out of 10 young people, whom I define those who, people who are between the ages of 15 and 29, voted in the 2000 election. Voter turnout was also quite high in Belarus and Ukraine, but there is a difference between the two countries. If you look at column 3, youth vote for their position. In Belarus, less than 1/3 of young people voted for a single candidate from their position at that time. And in Ukraine, more than half of young people voted for the opposition candidate, Viktor Yushchenko. So again, if you compare Azerbaijan and Georgia, you can see here that the voter turnout was actually quite low in both cases. But some public opinion, whatever data, whatever is available, suggests that I think it's indisputable that Mikhail Saakashvili in 2003 and some other opposition political parties enjoyed much more popular support than Isa Gambar or Karimli in 2005. So young people were not particularly thrilled about the opposition political parties at that time in those countries, in some of those countries. And the third indicator of cross-country differences or cross-movement differences in youth mobilization is the size of post-election protests and the length of post-election protests. Of course, it's not just young people who participated in these protest events. So, these numbers can be used as a proxy for youth mobilization. But certainly, young people turned out in large numbers. In Ukraine, at the peak of the Orange Revolution, as many as 1 million people poured into the street of downtown Kyiv to protest against electoral fraud. And thousands of people arrived in Belgrade to demand political change in 2000, in the fall of 2000. And in Azerbaijan and Belarus, protests attracted a significantly smaller number of people, and they also lasted a shorter period of time there were rallies held on certain dates, while in the other cases in Georgia and Ukraine, for some time, the political opposition occupied the public space permanently. So the question that I pose in my book is, why are there are these differences across youth movements? And I argue that the level of youth mobilization is affected by the extent to which the social movement and the incumbent government deploy innovative tactics and counteract each other's action. So I draw attention to the importance of tactical interactions, where on the one hand, the social movement tries to come up with innovative tactics to undermine the strength of the regime, and on the other hand, the ruling elite tries to counteract. And I think it's also important in this context to think about the importance of learning from previous protest campaigns inside the country and borrowing some creative ideas from other contexts. So very briefly, in the rest of my presentation, I'm going to talk about the importance of tactics and present some findings, drawing primarily on the example of Otpor, but I would welcome questions about the other youth movements during the Q&A. Of course, there are a lot of arguments in the social movement literature and civil resistance research trying to explain the level of mass mobilization. Consistent with civil literature perspective, this project focuses on the importance of tactics. And I think that Peter Ackerman and Hadi Merriman's checklist for ending tyranny provides a very useful framework for identifying shared capabilities, skills, and choices that form the common denominators of successful civil resistance movements. Ackerman and Merriman identify three key capacities of successful civil resistance movements. The first, the ability to unify people. Second, operational planning. And third, nonviolent discipline. And if these capabilities are present, then they set off three trends. First, they're more likely to increase civilian participation in civil resistance, diminish the impact of repression, increase backfire, and third, increase defections from a movement's adversary. And in my own research, I find support for their arguments about the importance of skills. When I look at state movement interactions, I distinguish between different types of tactics that social movements deploy and that also states use. Social movements need to think how to recruit new members and sustain contentious collective action. They need to develop ties with a wide range of allies, including non-governmental organizations and the international donor community. And of course, also the civil resistors need to think of how to challenge the regime and undermine its strengths. In turn, state authorities have a wide arsenal of repressive methods that they can use. Jennifer Earle distinguishes between state repression and channeling, which is a subtler form of repression that does not directly target the movement, but influences the movement's access to resources. And furthermore, in my project, I look at support for regime-friendly youth organizations as a method of repression against regime-threatening youth organizations. So for this project, I selected 5 different cases. Otpor is here treated as an initiator youth movement that set in motion the protest cycle. And then I compare the experiences of Otpor and I compare the experiences of Zubru in Belarus and Para in Ukraine, and Khmer in Georgia and the Azerbaijani youth groups. I pair them up in this way because I think that there are a lot of cultural similarities and geographical proximity in Belarus and Ukraine, or Georgia and Azerbaijan. So it's best to look at them in this context. I primarily rely on semi-structured interviews with former movement participants to analyze the state movement interactions. I also use additional publicly available sources, including newspaper articles, NGO reports, and other information that is available. Unfortunately, it's impossible at this point to speak with state officials who were responsible for the implementation of repressive methods at that time. In some of these countries remain non-democratic, and even those who have made some progress, like Serbia, for example, still keep their files on Otpor and on the Milosevic period closed for researchers. So, turning our attention to Otpor, why was it successful? What has it done? I would like to draw your attention to a few factors. First of all, consistent with Ackerman and Merriman's checklist, they were very effective at building a unity of the youth movement and developing a horizontal organizational structure. Even though leaders obviously were present in that movement, that they gave a lot of people a sense so that they could be leaders too at the local level. And they rotated the spokespeople, which also contributed to this sense of leaderless horizontal organizational structure. Otpor developed a two-track approach to civil resistance on the day of the elections. On the one hand, they launched a negative campaign, Gatovia, targeting the incumbent president. And you can see on the screen one of the stickers from that period where Milosevic was captured exiting the stage. So Otpor activists put this image on a sticker and then listed the date of the election, suggesting that it's time for him to go. And a positive campaign titled "Bring Me Here, It's Time" was targeting young people, especially first-time voters, in order to boost the youth voter turnout. Unlike opposition political parties, Otpor tried to create a culture of resistance rather than just organize simple protest rallies. So they designed a host of stickers, spray-painted graffiti, came up with original ideas for street performances, organized rock concerts, and most importantly, enforced nonviolent discipline in the movement. The youth movement also managed to generate outrage over repression. When young people began to get arrested by the police, it caused public outrage. And in fact, in Novi Sad, at that time, a group of women even decided to set up its own group, Otpor Mothers, to show support for youthful protesters. Otpor also succeeded in developing ties with influential allies, and in particular, they adopted a fraternizing approach to the police to try and increase the likelihood of defections, which is also consistent with the Ackerman and Merriman's argument about some trends that might diminish the impact of repression and increase defections from a movement's adversary. So, unlike the previous youth organizations, Otpor was effective in applying marketing techniques to civil resistance. And some of you might have seen an Otpor TV spot in which a woman puts a t-shirt with an image of Slobodan Milosevic in the laundry machine and then pushes the button with the logo of Otpor on it. Once the washing cycle is over, she pulls out the t-shirt out of the laundry machine and the image of Milosevic is gone. So it was a very simple and humorous way of sending a message to the people and to the ruling elite about the people's power, about the potential of ordinary citizens to change the status quo and go and vote on election day. They also, created T-shirts, mugs, umbrellas, and it became cool to be a member of Otpor, and I think it was one of the keys to its success. In response, the government of Serbia adopted a conventional set of repressive methods. They framed Otpor as a foreign mercenary, and the sticker on the slide was allegedly produced by the government, and here you can see how they try to draw upon some anti-Nazi and anti-American sentiments in Serbia at that time by labeling Otpor as Madlen Jugend. So it refers on the one hand to Hitler Jugend, a youth organization that was formed in Nazi Germany, and on the other hand to Madeleine Albright, US Secretary of State at that time. The police physically harassed a lot of Otpor activists in an unprecedented move. Hundreds of them were detained and fingerprinted. And one of the officials at the time said that Otpor is not a student organization or a political party. Otpor is a neo-fascist organization in the tradition of the Red Brigades, and the state will use the same means used by the other states when faced with terrorism of such proportions. The government actually failed to suppress this wave of youth mobilization. In response, Otpor launched a series of countermoves to manage to diminish the impact of repression and win popular support. I can talk about it later during the Q&A. So just wrapping up, I also wanted to mention, to show some slides referring to the other four youth movements in Belarus and Ukraine. They used similar methods of non-resistance, including stickers. And we can talk about it later, and I can explain how they differed in the choices that they have made and what kind of implications it had on their outcomes. Similarly, in Georgia and Azerbaijan, to various degrees, they used different methods of nonviolent resistance. So, wrapping up, what my project tries to accomplish is to contribute to social movement literature by exploring tactical interactions in non-democracies. because there is a lot of attention on the significance of state repression, but I believe that civil resistance still have some room for maneuvering, and they need to make very important choices on how to fight best against the incumbent government. This project also seeks to contribute to civil resistance literature by providing in-depth analysis of both successful and failed mobilization, emphasizing the importance of tactics. And finally, it speaks to comparative democratization literature by demonstrating the role of youth in electoral revolutions during a very critical period in the history of East European states. There might be some takeaway messages here for civic activists. One of the main things that my project seeks to illustrate is that operational planning is very important, and it's not just all about money. Of course, in general, it's often assumed that resource-rich movements have a higher chance of success, but it's also very important how civic resistors use the available resources in a creative way. And it's also vital to learn from previous episodes of contention, both inside and outside the country. In Ukraine, for example, there were several waves of mass mobilization in 1990. Ukrainian students went on a hunger strike to demand regime change in the Soviet Union. And then in 2000 to 2001, the Ukraine Without Kuchma movement was formed to demand the president's resignation before it culminated in the Orange Revolution. And as you know, more recently, Ukrainians went through another very rebellious period with the Euromaidan of 2013-2014. So with each of these episodes of contention, civic activists are learning something new and revising their approach to civil resistance. It's also important to build a heterogeneous base of support and spread beyond the capital city, because even despite the fact that the voter protests are happening usually on election day in the capital city, in a central square, it's critical to also have support in the provinces. And finally, for youth movements, it's vital to cultivate ties with influential allies, but maintain a significant degree of autonomy from various political actors, and especially opposition political parties, who often try to exploit youth energy to their advantage. So I'll end here, and I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olena. I really appreciate your going at that. I just want to remind people that there's two ways to do the questions. You can click on the raised hand, the electronic raised hand, and then I can unmute you and you could ask your question. People can also type in their questions. We already have one question in place that you talked about in the Otpor example, how the youth movement pressured the political parties, multiple political parties that were in the opposition, to coordinate and cooperate at a higher degree than they ever had. And then at the end, you talked about needing to influence parties, but also be independent of them. And I'm just wondering if, Otpor seemingly was quite successful at getting the opposition parties to collaborate. Is part of the different outcomes in the other cases you looked at related to this dynamic about how strong the youth movements could affect the parties while still maintaining independence?
Yes, thank you for this. Thank you for this question. I think it's very important to think of the relations between the youth movements and opposition political parties, because oftentimes youth activists face a lot of challenges, coming threats. I would say, not just from the government, but also from the opposition political parties who are really trying to control them and use to their advantage. In the case of Otpor, the youth movement have managed to establish itself as an independent force. It had a large number of members and it won popular trust. So they spent a lot of their energy initially to pressure opposition political parties to unite and to nominate a single candidate. For comparison, in the case of Belarus, for example, opposition political parties were squabbling for months. They were negotiating who would eventually be nominated as a single candidate from the opposition. And even despite the fact that youth activists favored another candidate, they picked an old trade union leader whom one of the journalists in the Western media described as not even marginally charismatic. So then it became very difficult for these youth activists to try and convince young voters to vote, to cast a ballot for him and to support him. In the case of Azerbaijan, there were just very overt ties between Unifikir, one of the youth movements, and the opposition political party Popular Front, because the youth activists lacked resources to rent office space. They just had a room inside the headquarters of an opposition political party. So it created a very awkward. It was a negative factor for them because a lot of people then did not perceive them as an independent force and thought that they were just puppet of the opposition political party. And in many of these countries, opposition political parties are not well trusted because they have been trying, they have been talking about civil resistance and regime change for years without really accomplishing much. So that's why youth movements, when they burst into the scene, they bring some whiff of fresh air, innovative ideas, and it does not sit well with the opposition political parties. In Azerbaijan, in particular, I was told that opposition political parties even sent their infiltrators, if you will, the spies, to keep an eye on the youth movements because they wanted to know what is going on inside those movements. And of course, these youth movements were also infiltrated by the security services.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have another question. Actually, there's sort of a cluster of questions that I'm seeing that look at the models that you're looking at are sort of mass-based movements for democratizing regimes that are sort of ruled by authoritarian ruling elites. Some people are wondering, are there any things that you've learned in that kind of struggle that might be useful to situations where it's not sort of the relatively mass-based dissatisfaction with an authoritarian ruling regime, but cases like Myanmar, where there's strong nationalism that ties a lot of the members to the regime and legitimates, in this case, anti-Rohingya, anti-Muslim activities. So is there anything you learned from your case studies that you think could be useful in sort of minority rights struggles where it's harder to immediately get to majority sympathy?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think if I can go just for a moment to my slides, I have one slide for Russia.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, so Russia was not, the Russian youth movements were not a part of my analysis. I limited my project to just 5 case studies, but certainly it's an interesting one, and I think it speaks to some of the issues that have been raised by the audience, the issue of nationalism. Because in Russia, the government watched what was happening in the region and thought about the ways in which they could co-opt youth. So the issue of nationalism became a very convenient tool to mobilize young people in favor of the current regime. And in 2005, they formed the youth movement Nashi, which literally means ours. So state-controlled media in Russia portrayed protests in Serbia, Georgia, and Ukraine as CIA coups, as some staged events sponsored by the Western governments, and try to propagate the idea that all those youth activists who joined PORA or Otpor were on the payroll of US government, and they really did not care much about the national interests in their home country. And indeed, this youth movement, Nashi, has struck a chord with many young people and was quite popular for some time. So it might be challenging for minority youth to develop a civil resistance campaign that will appeal also to the majority, but maybe they can just draw a lesson from what Alexei Navalny in Russia has done. And in his recent campaign, he does not talk much about democracy or Western liberal ideas. Instead, he just focuses on one single issue: corruption. And it is relatable to many people. A lot of youngsters understand that corruption is a perennial problem in Russia, and they are outrageous over it. So, so maybe as a suggestion, minority youth in such a context might tackle some issue that affects all the various segments in society, like corruption or socioeconomic inequality, even despite the fact that minority youth might be particularly affected by it.
Thank you. Another participant is asking sort of 2 related questions for you to, given your look at successful and less successful cases in Eastern Europe. One was, what role do you think was played in terms of success or failure of having a more horizontal movement leadership structure where there's shared leadership and multiple sources versus sort of a more top-down command and control type of organizational style? And then the other question is, did you notice any variables that about success or less success, possible failures, in terms of what kinds of external support outside of the country was made available to the movement. So if you could address those in turn, that would answer that question.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I'll start with external support, because I think there is a lot of attention on this issue, and there are a lot of conspiracy theories out there that oftentimes autocrats propagate in order to discredit any successful resistance campaign outside their borders, and to discourage their citizens to try and emulate the example. And here, I think that the case of Otpor might be very useful. In Serbia, the economy during the late 1990s was in very bad shape. They went through a period of hyperinflation. UN sanctions imposed the international isolation of the country, so they lacked a large middle class that would provide financial support for the youth movement. So Serbian activists did accept some resources, I don't know, some grants or whatever, from the international donor community, for example, to print stickers or to buy T-shirts. What is important to keep in mind is that youth activists still had a lot of freedom in how they could use these resources, and how they could really design stickers or come up with slogans that would appeal to youth. And here, Western governments are not very helpful, because they don't fully often understand the context. In the case of Belarus, actually, there are some reports suggesting that the West played a somewhat negative role by pushing upon the opposition political parties, or advising them to choose Hancharik as a single leader from the opposition. Because in the case of Serbia, Koštunica was a candidate that was quite appealing to the nationalists. So it was easier to win over some of the electorate that would traditionally vote for Milosevic. They just went over to a more radical, more nationalist candidate. But in the case of Belarus, also felt that maybe some proximity between Lukashenko and Hancharik would allow some of his traditional voters to shift sides, and it just did work this way. Hancharik was not the one around whom people would have mobilized, and the economy was also doing quite well, so Lukashenko benefited from it. And speaking of external support, I think it's also very important to keep in mind that it's not just the Western governments that provide support to civil resistance. It's also, in some cases, authoritarian governments in other countries who are providing support for autocrats. And in the case of Belarus specifically, on the eve of the 2001 presidential election, the Russian government gave Lukashenko a large loan, which allowed him to then distribute some welfare benefits around within his electorate, and basically buy votes. And for many years, the Belarusian economy has been dependent on the cheap provision of energy resources from the Russian government.
Well, thank you so much. We're running close to the end of the time. There's a question or two that we haven't gotten to that I will send you, Olena, the questions, and then we can post those online. I'd like to say to other people that if you have more questions that you haven't inputted yet, feel free to send them to webinar@nonviolent-conflict.org. Want to remind people that there's a recording of this webinar, which will be posted shortly, usually within a couple of days on the website under webinars, so you can look for that. And please feel free to join us on Facebook or Twitter, and we have information for there. And before we close out today, then once we close out, there'll be a chance for you to answer just a short survey of about 4 questions that will help us analyze the webinar and make the webinar series more helpful to you. But we also want to give you some information about 2 upcoming webinars from ICNC. One is next month on March 27th at noon. We will have a focus on Hungarian civil disobedience campaigns against housing evictions. And that will be at noon again, Eastern time in the US. On April 24th, at the same time of the day, we'll have Michael Beer, who's going to be talking about nonviolent action methods. And he took the classic statement by Gene Sharp that listed, I think it was 198 different nonviolent actions. He's increased that by many, and will be explaining that, but he's also done some reconceptualizing, and that's based on a ICNC monograph that we will have published in April. And so those are 2 upcoming things. And if you want to register, just go online to our upcoming webinars slide on the web page. And I want to thank you again, Olena, for taking the time. I want to thank everybody who's participated in this. And I will be shutting the webinar down now, and hope everybody will stay online to finish out the short survey. So thank you very much.